Hi, welcome to our 9 a.m. press conference, How Animals Will Fare in a Changing Climate. Our participants are Kristin Laidre from the Polar Science Center in the Applied Physics Laboratory at the University of Washington in Seattle, David Stoner at Utah State University in Logan, Utah, and Andrey Petrov from the University of Northern Iowa in Cedar Falls, Iowa.
All right, well, good morning and thank you for being here. My name is Kristin Laidre, and I'm going to talk to you about a paper that was just released in Biology Letters titled Conservation Status of Polar Bears in Relation to Projected Sea Ice Declines. So this paper was led by Dr. Eric Regier from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was a piece of work where multiple people were involved, all members of the IUCN's Polar Bear Specialist Group. So the main findings of this work, there are sort of three categories. First is we show potential for large reductions in the global population of polar bears in 35 to 40 years as Arctic sea ice loss continues. And we looked at three different categories of reduction. So the probability of a reduction greater than 30% is 0.71. And basically what this means is that under the set of hypotheses and assumptions that we put forward in this paper, there's a high likelihood, about a 70% chance, that the world's polar bear population will be reduced by about a third in the next 35 or so years, according to our methods. Looking at probabilities larger than that, the probability of a reduction greater than 50% was 0.07, and the probability of reduction of greater than 80% was negligible. So basically, reductions more than a third are not very likely. Second, the findings supported the listing of polar bears as vulnerable under the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, the IUCN Red List. And third, our work demonstrates large uncertainty in statistical projections for the global population of polar bears due to their variable status and uncertainty in data. I'll talk more about that. So sea ice is the primary habitat for polar bears. They use sea ice for all aspects of their life history. They use ice for traveling. They use ice for hunting, finding their primary prey, which are ring seals and bearded seals. They use ice for finding mates and breeding, and in some areas they use ice for maternity denning. So there's lots of work indicating multiple stressors on polar bears, which include, in some cases, human impacts, but the consensus is the main driver of what's going to happen in the future for bears is related to sea ice loss. Also should note that they're important subsistence species across the Arctic. There are 19 subpopulations of polar bears. They're shown here on the map, outlined with the labels for each subpopulation. Those subpopulations are defined by how bears move around and genetics. And there are what we call 4 ecoregions. So these ecoregions characterize the behavior of the ice in the Arctic and how that ice affects the life history of bears. So for example, it doesn't look green, but in the green region, which is kind of on the lower part of your screen, that's the seasonal ice ecoregion where ice clears out completely in summer and all bears move onto land to fast. But that doesn't happen in all parts of the Arctic. So there's variability and uncertainty in the status of polar bears. This is based on the best available scientific information. Some populations are decreasing, some are stable, and at least one is increasing despite sea ice loss. And the reasons for that are also variable. So there are time lags in the response of polar bear abundance with loss of sea ice. In some places, there are ecological changes that occur that actually confer benefits to bears in the near term. The areas become more productive. Lighter ice conditions result in population blooms of primary productivity. And there's nonlinear responses. Second, we have a lot of uncertainty in the polar bear status. There are many populations that have never been studied or studied very little. But in general, over the near and midterm, there's likely to continue to be variability in the response of polar bear abundance to sea ice loss. But for certain, because of their fundamental dependence on ice, looking forward, all subpopulations will be negatively impacted by the loss of ice. So we had 3 steps in our analysis. The first step was to estimate what we call generation length. This is basically the average age of adult females with cubs of the year. You can see in the two pictures, the top right, they're small cubs. Those are cubs of the year. They're newborn cubs. They stay with their mother for about 2 years until they're about the size of the bloody ones on the bottom. We looked at ages from captured bears from 11 different subpopulations, over 3,000 adult females, to estimate a generation length. And this generation length is used in conservation assessments. Usually you're looking some number of generations forward in time. And our generation length was 11.5 years, the global mean. So then we used NASA sea ice data, and this was really critical for this analysis. Basically, we were able to look back in time over the satellite observation period and develop a metric specific to polar bears and polar bear habitat, and look how that metric has changed across the satellite record. We found that there's been a significant decline in polar bear habitat across all 19 subpopulation regions, and that linear decline was then projected into the future over 3 generations, so about 35 to 40 years, using the fits to the linear models to that satellite metric. Then the step 3 for our work was basically to use a suite of hypotheses, evaluate a number of different hypotheses that assume relationships between polar bears and sea ice. The first is a very simple one, where we assume a 1-to-1 proportional relationship between sea ice loss and abundance for each subpopulation. This is pretty common in red list assessments, but it's a simplifying assumption. And the second was to use all available data for polar bears globally and on an ecoregion specific level to evaluate the relationships between changes in polar bear abundance and sea ice loss. This is not a population model. We do not have the data to build a global population model for polar bears. These are basically a suite of hypotheses looking forward in time. Or another way to look at it is the first database sensitivity evaluating the potential response of the global population of polar bears to projected sea ice declines. And just to wrap up here, previous methods that have looked at this have really been based on either expert interviews or Bayesian belief networks, which incorporate expert interviews into qualitative effects of change in sort of a model structure, or they've been very specific to subpopulations. So this is the first analysis that actually uses estimates of abundance and trend available across the Arctic for polar bears to evaluate their future status. The lead author is Eric Regier. His email address is up there and mine below. And then the two papers that came out of this work supported by NASA are listed. Thank you very much. I'll just let you. Let's see, does the mouse work? Strange, the mouse doesn't.
There it is. Okay, so there's you. Which one are you, sir?
That one, the black.
That one?
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's the problem with the extended desktop.
Thanks. Good morning. Thanks for attending. I'm going to discuss a project. It's wrapping up, though there are some ongoing aspects to it, using satellite imagery to estimate abundance of 2 large game animals that are widely distributed across the southwestern United States and western North America broadly. The project is a joint effort funded primarily by NASA, but also involving Utah State University, Northern Arizona University, several USGS labs, and the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources. Okay. So one of the major constraints to incorporating satellite imagery into wildlife management is that managers need estimates of abundance. And what we found was that satellite measures of vegetation, as sensed through satellite imagery, were very good predictors of mule deer and mountain lion abundance across climatic zones. And these are species of great management significance over western North America. Importantly, climate and land use forecasts for this region suggest two things. One, warming and drying combined with increased fragmentation of habitat. And these, in conjunction, are likely to lead toward population declines of some of these very large, wide-ranging migratory animals. And this will have economic implications. So at the root of all this is our images or monitoring of vegetation. And so when we look at our study region, the colors here really represent a fairly intuitive approach to density of vegetation, with the dark browns representing sparsely vegetated deserts up into the bright greens representing the mountain forests. And this imagery reflects the average conditions for the period 2000 to 2014, the satellite record that we're working with. But we wanted to assess the implications of drought for the region, which is one of the major forecasts. That droughts will become more common and more severe and last longer. And so we used the year 2002, in which precipitation was 30% below the long-term mean, and ran our models on this under the two scenarios, both the average and then the drought conditions. And so when we look at mule deer, keeping in mind that these animals have a direct relationship with vegetation, they are herbivores, they eat vegetation, what we found was they have a very strong relationship with it, and it's easily predictable with satellite imagery. And so their distribution, they're widely distributed, the colors representing density, with blue being the cool colors being low densities, and red the higher densities associated with those mountain forests. But what I'd like you to focus your attention on are the white polygons. These are areas where vegetation is so sparse that it cannot support an animal of this size. And so when we project what the densities may look like with respect to drought, what we see is a very large contraction in the range. This is about 12% contraction of area occupied and about a 20% reduction in abundance. Now, when we move on and look at the mountain lion, which is an obligate carnivore, its economy is directly tied to mule deer. That's its primary food resource. We were very surprised that the vegetation indices were very good predictors of mountain lion abundance as well, even though they exhibit only an indirect relationship with vegetation. And so what we see right off the bat is the white areas are much larger. This reflects their lower abundance relative to their primary prey, and so the productivity of the environment has to be substantially higher just to support these animals. And when we look at that distribution under drought conditions, what we see is a very substantial contraction into the mountain ecoregions and complete loss from the major deserts, the Mojave, the Colorado Plateau, and the Great Basin. And so in addition to lower abundance, we see severe fragmentation of the habitat simply on vegetation alone. So if we step back and use an analogy, if climate is driving the system here, the major question is, how does variation in moisture ripple through this system? And so I like to use the whip analogy in that a very small motion at the base of the whip results in a crack at the other end. And so if the base is climatically driven vegetation, and that's translated into forbs and grasses and plants that mule deer need for their nutritional requirements, this is converted into essentially reproduction. So reproductive rates are going to be higher during wet years or in wet areas relative to drier areas. And at the top of the food chain is our mountain lion, the carnivore that feeds directly on productivity of its prey base. And these fawns are the major food resource, and so variation in those fawns converts into changes in density and home range size. So if our animal uses a home range of some area, in wet conditions, it looks small, but under our drought scenario where things dry out, we get lower productivity in the vegetation. We see that played out through reduced reproduction of the major prey, and so then our top carnivores need commensurately larger space, which holds fewer animals. Okay, so just a couple points to summarize with. First, use of satellite imagery in wildlife management. To date, this has been underutilized by wildlife agencies. There are other natural resource agencies that have incorporated satellite imagery to a greater extent. But if we are able to do this, it should reduce costs in terms of estimated abundance of some of these valued animals, result in higher precision with those counts, and then allows us to make projections at very broad scale. So we can cross jurisdictional boundaries and look at the abundance of animals that migrate and use large spaces irrespective of jurisdictions. Secondly, it's important to recognize wildlife-related recreation has tremendous economic benefits. And these are largely through hunting, fishing, bird watching, and various festivals associated with these animals. And this amounts nationally to almost $150 billion per year in economic activity. There is a cost, however, and those costs are largely borne out by agricultural depredation, vehicle collisions, and human safety concerns associated with that. However, the ratio of the benefit to cost is tremendously disproportionate, with being approximately 30 times more benefit than cost. However, under the scenario that we are looking at, what we are projecting is that these benefits will be reduced. This is because of the lower number of animals that the environment will be able to support, impacting those benefits. But simultaneously with that, the costs are likely to rise. And this is because anthropogenic landscapes, agriculture and urban areas are irrigated, they're fairly consistent, and so as conditions in native habitat diminish or become more arid, it makes those human landscapes all the more attractive and appealing. And so we would project that some of these conflicts related to animals will increase. So with that, thank you for your attention.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for being here for us. So we switch gear back to the Arctic a little bit and talk about a different set of animals. So this study is focusing on wild reindeer relative to caribou in the Russian Arctic in Taimyr, Russia. So it's mostly funded by NSF, but NASA, of course, contributed through satellite imagery as well as through some funding early in the stage of the project. So, as some of you probably heard, the reindeer population in the world, both caribou and reindeer, is declining. It's declining pretty rapidly. So we don't know why it's happening, and that's part of the reason why we are looking at this study. So, secondly, we find using multiple data sets, mostly airborne imagery and satellite imagery, that reindeer in Taimyr, as well as in other places, exhibit incredible spatial fidelity, meaning that they come to the same areas over and over again. At the same time, in the last 2 decades, we see dramatic shift in migration, moving to different areas because mostly of climate change as well as human activity. The changes that are responsible for this shift are warmer temperatures, increased mosquito harassment, and of course, early opening of the rivers and other elements, plus the human impact that is observed throughout the habitat. Sorry, it doesn't shift anymore somehow. Something's going on here.
Let's try the arrow key. Looks like it's. What did it do there?
So I guess I could continue a little bit and saying that the last part that I will be talking about quickly is that we tested a hypothesis that is very frequently placed that the decline in world reindeer and caribou population related to overgrazing in certain areas because of the increase in that population throughout the 90s. So that's what we maybe this one. Here you go. Wonderful. Sorry. So as you can see on the map right there, there is a multiple reindeer population, reindeer and caribou population in the world. And all in red are the ones that are declining. And at present, there are about 2.5 million reindeer and caribou. 600,000 of them live in Taimyr. And the area that we are studying is actually right here. This is the Taimyr area. This is the population of Taimyr reindeer herd. It's wild reindeer herd. Again, it was stable and then increased dramatically in the 90s, then crashed and going down right now. So we were about 1 million here and about 600,000 now. So that's the area of habitation. So this is Taimyr Peninsula right there in the northern tip of Russia. And of course, reindeer has the annual cycle going from winter grounds to calving grounds to summer grounds here and then returning back every year. How we observe them, we have airborne surveys since 1969 through 2009. And then, of course, we also have satellite data, including the reindeer colors data. And we utilize Landsat for monitoring landscapes in which they move. So what are the changes that are very important here is the climate change. First of all, warming in Taimyr has been detected, 1.5 degrees centigrade increase, unstable winters with icing events, river opens earlier, summer grounds move north, of course, as we'll see in a second, and resulting in increased mosquito harassment, and greening of tundra is an important thing because of the forage availability. And wildfires also have been increasing. And on the other hand, there's a human activity, which is infrastructure, is an obstacle, hunting pressure, disturbance and pollution in the western part of the habitat, and of course, competition with the domestic reindeer and lack of predator control, which is increase of wolf population. So what do we see here? So first of all, we look at different seasons. So this is a summer season, and what we see is that we still observe the spatial fidelity, meaning that the reindeer still comes to the similar areas. There are 4 areas that have been visited almost every year right there on that map. However, since 2000, we see that they deviate further away from historical locations, moving primarily east and north as a result of moving away from warmer temperatures and avoiding mosquito harassment. They also utilizing smaller percentages of the range, so it's really shifting. They also go higher in elevation, again for the same reason, get away from warmer temperatures and from mosquitoes. And we see the big decline of population in the western part of the habitat, and human activity mostly concentrated here in the western part of the habitat. So same patterns observed during calving and winter habitation, right? So on the right, on the left is the calving grounds. This is the winter grounds. Again, we observe on more than 2 decades. You can see again shift to the east, a little bit to the south. So which means that there's a longer distances to travel between calving and summer ranges, which increases calf mortality because, well, first of all, it's longer distances and the rivers are opening as well, so they have to swim instead of walking across them using ice. And that's, of course, one of the reasons we believe is that the population is declining. Now, the last piece of this evidence that is important to us is that whether decline in reindeer population, wild reindeer population in Taimyr is anyway related to vegetation. And you see here the typical hypothesis that caribou population, which is referring to North America in this case, may result, the fluctuations may result because of the increase in forage and decrease in forage availability. So what we did, we took satellite imagery from 2000 when we knew the reindeer herd was there, right there in the spot, right here in this part of the habitat. We knew, we flew over them. And we looked at the vegetation condition using index NDVI, which is sort of reflecting the greenness, which is a proxy of biomass here. And we looked at whether it was depressed when the reindeer was present, so the eating out the biomass, which was true. But then what we noticed when we had 2 weeks later, we had another image of that very same area, and we saw that it actually was quickly recovering right here. So basically, while reindeer eats out a lot of the green biomass, it actually recovers fairly fast. So basically, we see depression and quick recovery of that index. So which tells us that actually maybe wild reindeer is managing the territory. So there is no really evidence that in this case, at least, it was overgrazing and that vegetation was trampled and permanently damaged. However, that would be different for domestic reindeer probably. So what are the main take-home messages from this? First, wild reindeer and caribou population is in decline around the world. There is strong evidence of long-term spatial fidelity. So reindeer return to the same location year after year. So we know where they're going to be, most likely, and we need to make sure that we protect those areas, that those areas are not being damaged either by pollution or by other human activity. But at the same time, we see migration shift in summer habitats to the north and northeast and going up in elevation, which is, of course, following the climate change because of the going to colder conditions. And of course, recent shifts in calving areas and summer also means that we have the increased distance and increased difficulty for calves to move, and that decreases population in the area. So, and of course, as I said, satellite imagery shows that the arrival of reindeer to new grounds does not seem to lead to overgrazing, at least immediately. So the wild population have a way, even when they enlarge in numbers. In 2000, I remind you, was the largest number we've ever recorded, 1 million reindeer. Still seems like habitat is being used rationally. So these are the important messages from that.
Okay, great, thank you. Are there any questions from reporters in the room? Please raise your hand and state your name and affiliation.
Hi, I'm Pearl Tessler from the Exploratorium. I have a question for you about the reindeer. You showed a graph that seemed to indicate a recent, say in the last few years, decline down to the current 600,000 number, but it also looked on that graph as though if you go back maybe 10 years, we were on an increase. Could you explain that?
Is that the mics here? Oh, yes, that's a great observation. And the main reason that we believe that the population increase was the changes in actually hunting system, and that's related to demise of the Soviet hunting system using certain state enterprises that were in charge of it. In the 90s, they kind of fell apart. So that was not done, and that's exploded the population. But at the same time, we also have an explosion of wolf population in the area, right? So because of the failure of the same system, so it caught up in 2000s, and now it's going down, I think. So that's the primary hypothesis here.
Are there any other questions from reporters in the room?
I'm Ned Roselle, and I write for Alaska newspapers. A couple questions. David, what percentage of a mountain lion's diet are mule deer?
So in the Great Basin, the Rocky Mountain West, mule deer comprise on average about 60% of the diet. It varies locally. They do eat elk, wild horses. In Alberta, they eat moose calves, bighorn sheep, livestock. So there's a lot of things that they feed on, but mule deer are far and away the most prevalent large ungulate in the diet.
Gotcha. And Andrey, I'm a little confused with the reindeer designation because, like in Alaska,
It's caribou.
Reindeer are domesticated caribou, and we don't use the term wild reindeer. Could you explain what these animals are?
Yeah, so these would be relatives of both, but they're wild reindeer. So the reindeer you have is domestic, which was brought, of course, from Scandinavia to Alaska. I mean, they're relatives. Rangifer tarandus relatives are here in Taimyr, and they're wild. And again, caribou is also, it's just subspecies of the same Rangifer tarandus. So we're talking about Rangifer tarandus, which is, inhabiting Taimyr, and it is a wild range. So there's no domestication whatsoever of that particular one.
Okay, thank you.
Are there any other questions in the room?
Thanks. Hi, my name's Maddie Stone. I'm the science editor for Gizmodo. This question's for Kristin. I was hoping you could elaborate on the population projections you had for polar bears, given sea ice decline. Maybe I just missed this, but did you have a projection as to the overall number and also which subpopulations are going to be impacted the most?
Yeah, so we did a global analysis in this paper, so we did not look at specific or individual subpopulations of bears, largely because the data are so variable across the range. And we didn't actually project a specific number. We projected a probability of a certain level of decline. I should have mentioned on the slide, we at the moment believe we have about 26,000 polar bears globally. So I mean, you could take that number and kind of make some guesses forward, but really we are aiming at levels of decline for IUCN.
Okay. And those levels of decline, that was the subject of your more recent paper. You mentioned there were 2 papers.
Yeah, so the sea ice metrics, so we did one paper where we looked specifically at habitat metrics for polar bears and used satellite data to assess how those have changed across the global range. And then that fed into the second paper, which I presented here, led by Eric Regier, where we looked at how those habitat metrics relate to potential declines in the future.
Thank you.
It's Mike Kralowitz from the NASA Earth Observatory. I guess any of you could answer this, or all of you. There's an implication I heard an implication that satellite data could be used, could have applications in management. How does that work? I mean, how okay, yes, you've helped figure out population dynamics, vegetation, but as an active tool, how can satellites be used how can they help management of these animals?
You want me to go?
Yeah.
Yeah, I am an advocate of integration of satellite imagery with wildlife management. The reason is that what we can do is ground our population estimates with an index of environmental variation. So right now, most of our abundance estimates are counts made from helicopters, and then population modeling is done to come up with estimates for given areas. By integrating the imagery, we're actually looking at how environmental conditions vary through space and time, and the animal abundance is strongly tied to that variability, at least in the arid regions where I work. And so, to answer your question directly, how can it be used? If it were brought in alongside as a means of monitoring environmental conditions, specifically range conditions through time and space, it could help make better predictions about population growth rates and trends.
Can I just add, it's largely also the same for polar bears. I mean, polar bears were listed under the U.S. Endangered Species Act not because of observed declines at the time, but because of forecast declines looking forward into the future, given what we project for loss of sea ice in the Arctic. And so the sea ice data and the satellite data are absolutely critical for understanding how what we observe and the time series that we get now are related to that, which is largely what I spoke about. And further, one step further is, when you're dealing with a resource like polar bears are a really critical subsistence resource around the Arctic, understanding those declines is important for management of that resource and for scientific advice for potential quotas and things like that. So the satellite data are really, really critical.
And if I may add, it's even more critical in remote areas where there's very few other methods of observations, right? I mean, we have satellites that go in there, on a regular basis, as opposed to aerial surveys that go every few years, if that. So if we find a way to actually connect what we see on vegetation imagery with actual abundance figures, that would be wonderful, and that would be really breakthrough, actually, and that's what we're trying to do.
Harvey Lyford, freelance. I attended a conference in Washington a year or two ago, I forget, and these were all climate change deniers at this conference. That's who sponsored it. And they were really poo-pooing the whole polar bear decline, narrative. I'm wondering, do you get a lot of political pushback on the studies you've been doing? And do you find that people think that you are being political in making these projections? And do you expect things to get better or worse in the future?
I mean, our primary objectives as scientists is not to become political, but to look at the data and do an objective assessment and present the best available evidence for what we know, and that's what we've really done here in this study. I think obviously there's a lot of different takes on that. One of the most important things for us in this study was to very, very explicitly outline our assumptions, outline our uncertainty, outline where there are things that are variable, and present that out on the table, because that exists. I mean, that's what science is. It's full of uncertainty and variability, and so our goal was not to have something clouded in mystery, but have something really clear. And in what I described to you, that there is variability in the status of polar bears right now, but that doesn't mean at the same time, if you have a species with a fundamental dependence on sea ice for all aspects of its life history, that when you don't have sea ice, you won't have a problem. So those two things can exist at the same time, and I think that's a big part of the messaging that needs to be done to the public to help them understand the current status and the future status of bears.
Are there any other questions in the room?
Ann Rosenthal, Nature Nearby. I'm interested, Andrey, in indirect effects on reindeer caused by effects on the wolf population from climate change.
So you're interested in connections there? What? Well, so that's a very good question, and actually maybe I start by a little bit back into the previous question, saying that when you study populations like wild reindeer and taimyr, which is the fundamental element of subsistence economy, it's inevitably becoming something that has economic and political ties, whether it's a local population or globally, and that's very important. That's why we study that. I mean, that's why it is so critical to understand. Now, when you go to wolf population, the increase in wolf population is largely related to two things. One is deregulation of hunting, or actually the dismantling of the hunting quota system that was in the past, in the Soviet times. So when hunters received substantial, actually, rewards for killing wolves, so they were, that system kept the wolf population limited. Now, when the system dismantled, on the other hand, we have increase in reindeer population. So as a result, we have the increase in wolf population. So that is the idea, basically. Plus possibly conditions for wolf survival improved because of the other changes in climate system. But that's the idea. And now, of course, this increased wolf population increases predatory pressure on reindeer. So that is the idea. Another element, if I may just quickly say, is that hunting. When again, we're talking back to political thing, a big number of reindeer being killed every year for subsistence. And some of my Russian colleagues will tell you that this is the primary cause of decline, alongside with the climatic changes. And we also need to understand that. But again, when you go to this area, that's becoming much more difficult to discern because of the various political and economic issues, which is, of course, related to wolf population as well. Because again, it's an economic incentive to limit it that was no longer there.
We have a question on the chat.
We have a question for Kristin from Laura Zuckerman from Reuters. Would you kindly repeat the projected population declines for polar bears?
Yeah, so the key finding was that given our set of the assumptions that we made and the hypothesis we put forward in the study, there's a high likelihood, about a 70% chance, of a decline in the global population of polar bears of about a third in the next 35 to 40 years.
Are there any other questions in the room? Okay.
Hi, Jennifer Lehman with Science Today at the California Academy of Sciences. This question is for Kristin. You mentioned that some populations are decreasing, some are stable, and some are actually increasing. Do you think you could elaborate on some of those, say, ecological benefits that?
Yeah, sure. So there's different reasons for population trends with polar bears, and I think I should preface this whole thing by saying there are actually very few populations where we have good trend data. There are only 2 or 3 populations that are studied annually where we have very good time series. Many of the other polar bear populations in the Arctic, we may have 1 data point or we might have 2, and they're separated by very long time periods. So there's a lot of uncertainty just because of that. But you know, there's different reasons for why you may have different trends despite kind of sea ice loss across the Arctic. The first is that in some areas are more ecologically productive, and so you can have a loss of sea ice, but it hasn't actually translated into effects on the population numbers yet because the area is so productive. A good example of that is the Chukchi Sea in Alaska, which is a very productive population, has shown losses of sea ice, and bears are in better condition than they were a couple decades ago. They're reproducing just as well as they were. So that's in contrast to areas where you may have the same rate of sea ice loss, but not the same productivity. Or you may have bears that have to spend a long period of time on land fasting, and that, of course, affects condition. The other 2 things are their time lags. When you're looking at changes in animal numbers and changes in the environment, it's not kind of one-to-one just happening like a train going down the tracks. You know, you might move along and suddenly have a threshold effect, and then your population is going to drop. And then, of course, there's what we call nonlinear responses, which sounds kind of fancy, but it's basically that it's not a one-to-one correlation, right? You know, you have changes in the system that kind of build up some inertia, and then you might have a big nonlinear, change that affects the numbers. But basically, there is variability in productivity across the Arctic, and some of those things translate to bears in specific areas. Did that answer your question?
Are there any other questions in the room? Are there any questions on the chat? Okay, that concludes our press conference. Thank you very much. Our next press event will be a media availability with Prince Albert of Monaco at 10:45. Thank you.